to Sisters of the Shadows, where mystery meets meaning. Together, we'll explore stories that spark curiosity and connection. Step into the circle, the shadows await.
Some buildings don't just hold history, they hold the people shaped by it. Tonight, we're exploring California's most unsettling structures, a place built to reform troubled boys, but remembered for trauma, punishment, and stories that refuse to stay buried. This is Preston Castle, and the boys who walked the halls left echoes that still linger. And this is Sister of the Shadows. I'm Jada, and today we're diving into the history and hauntings of Preston Castle in Ione, California, once known as the Preston School of Industry. It opened in 1894 as the state's first reform school for boys. The goal was rehabilitation. The reality was far more complicated. Over the decades, Preston became known for its harsh discipline, solitary confinement, forced labor, and unfortunately, several deaths, some documented, others just whispered about. And even now, long after the last boy has left, people say the building still echoes with the lives that passed through it. While researching, what struck me interesting was how young some of the boys were. Some were as young as 5 or 6. Many weren't even criminals. They were children who needed care. And instead, they were sent to a place that operated more like a prison than a school.
What stands out about Preston Castle is a contrast between what is promised, what is delivered. It was meant to rehabilitate boys, educating them and giving them structure. But many were sent there for minor offenses and met with harsh discipline instead. For a lot of them, it didn't feel like guidance, it felt more like punishment.
That contrast between the promises of Preston Castle and the harsh reality faced by its residents is really alarming. Intended as a hub for rehabilitation and education, it instead became a site of discipline for boys, often for minor offenses. This reveals significant failures in the juvenile justice system at the time. The legacy of such institutions highlights the need for compassionate approaches to youth rehabilitation that prioritize healing over punishment, ensuring that every child's well being and potential is being recognized.
Right. So to understand Preston Castle, you must understand the era it was born into. In the late 1800s, California was struggling with what was labeled youth crime. The definition for this youth crime refers to illegal or harmful behavior committed by an individual who was not yet a legal adult, typically those who are under 18. This includes both minor offenses like truancy or vandalism to more serious acts such as theft or assault. These were often influenced by developmental, social, or environmental factors. But many of the boys that were sent to Preston weren't criminals at all. They were actually orphans, runaways, considered unruly, or some were just sent there because their families couldn't take care of them. The castle itself was massive. A Romanesque structure with thick stone walls and a looming presence. It was meant to symbolize strength and order, but inside the conditions were far from ideal. Historical records describe the structure as military styled routines, physical punishments, long hours of labor, limited education, and isolation, even for minor infractions. The boys lived in dormitories, worked on farms, and were expected to reform through discipline and hard work. But the system often failed them. And one thing that really stood out to me was how self-sustaining Preston was. They had their own dairy farm, blacksmith shop, bakery, power generators, and most of the labor was done by the boys. And the construction, a lot of that was done by the inmates too. Imagine being a child building walls of a place that's going to confine you.
Understanding Preston Castle requires a glimpse into the era it emerged from. In the late 1800s, California struggled with its perception of youth crime, often labeling boys who were orphans, runaways, or unruly as delinquents. Many were sent there for not criminal behavior, but because their families couldn't take care of them. While the imposing Romanesque revival structure symbolized strength and order, the conditions inside were harsh. Historical records reveal strict military routines, physical punishment, long hours of labor, and isolation for very minor infractions. This raises significant ethical questions about the efficacy and morality of reform schools, as the system often failed to provide the necessary support, leading to further trauma rather than genuine rehabilitation.
Wow. What stays with me is how easily the line between help and punishment disappeared. These boys weren't dangerous. Many were just poor, alone, or unwanted. Preston was supposed to help them. Instead, it taught them fear. And when a system claims it's about reform but relies on control and suffering, that's not rehabilitation. That's confinement.
Okay. So, while Preston's castle was intended to be a place of rehabilitation, its history includes several tragedies, unfortunately. One of the most infamous cases is the 1950 murder of Anna Corbin, the housekeeper. She was found beaten to death in the basement. And a young ward was tried 3 times and ultimately acquitted for this crime. So this case remains unsolved. But Anna wasn't the only one who died at Preston. Records show that boys died from things like tuberculosis, accidents, neglect, and in some cases, just unexplained circumstances. While some deaths were documented, others were quietly buried in the institution cemetery. And over time, stories began to circulate, stories of voices, footsteps, and shadows that didn't belong to the living. And the deeper you go into the records, the more gaps you find. Missing death logs, boys listed as ill who were suddenly sent home but never heard from again, staff reporting bodies removed quietly at night, and some boys buried in unmarked graves. Others were just never accounted for at all. One of the earliest sets of boys photographed at Preston, there were 7 of them. One of them was killed in a barroom brawl just months after leaving. That tells you how little the support was that they got when they left.
That's crazy. What makes this part of Preston's history so unsettling is how normalized deaths became inside institutions like this. Tuberculosis, accidents, neglect, those weren't seen as failures of the system. They were treated as unfortunate but acceptable losses. When boys died, it rarely sparked reform, it rarely sparked outrage. It was paperwork, a burial, and then life inside the castle continued. That kind of quiet acceptance says a lot about how little value was placed on the lives of the boys inside.
The normalization of death in institutions like Preston reveals a truly disturbing disregard for marginalized youth. It's troubling that such losses were met with apathy, indicating a systemic failure to value the lives of these boys. This lack of outrage stifled opportunities for meaningful reform and raises important questions about the ethical responsibilities of care institutions. The tragedy of those lost lives reminds us of the necessity to advocate for the protection and dignity of every child, ensuring that such indifference is never repeated.
Right. And so let's talk about the basement. The basement of Preston Castle is the center of most of the paranormal claims, but historically, it is also the heart of the institution's discipline system. It held the solitary confinement rooms, the isolation cells, the storage areas, and the utility corridors. The solitary rooms were small, dark, and cold. Some still has scratch marks on the inside of the doors, and whether those marks were made by the boys at the time is unclear, but they contribute to the unsettling atmosphere. Former staff described the basement as a place of fear and a place that the boys really dreaded. Visitors and investigators have reported hearing scratching sounds, whispers, feeling sudden cold spots, the feeling of being touched, or voices captured on auto recordings. These reports span decades and come from people with no connection to each other. The basement is where some of the most disturbing historical details show up. There was something called the blood room, which sounds super creepy, but it was used for medical exams and forced cleanings, usually after someone had been beaten. Boys were also punished by being forced to sit and stare at a wall for days without speaking. And when you hear modern reports of marching footsteps, boys standing in doorways of locked wards, the barefoot boy on the stairs, it lines up eerily well with the routines and trauma these kids actually live through.
The haunting stories from the basement of Preston Castle reveal a dark history deeply tied to the institution's discipline system. The small, cold, solitary confinement rooms with those scratch marks on the doors evoke the fear and suffering experienced by these boys. Reports from visitors of those scratching sounds, whispers, and unexplained cold spots enhances the unsettling reputation of this space. The emotional impact of such isolation on children is profound, often leading to lasting trauma. The persistent, independent accounts of paranormal activities suggest that something continues to linger in that basement, making it a focal point for both historical reflection and intrigue.
That's what makes the basement so heavy. Even without the stories, its purpose alone is unsettling. Children were taken there to be alone in the dark as punishment. Experiences like that don't disappear when the doors open again. So, what people talk about whispers or voices, it doesn't feel surprising. It feels like echoes of fear that never had anywhere to go.
So when you look at places like Preston Castle, you start to realize it wasn't the only institution built on good intentions that twisted into something darker. California has its shadows, but so does the rest of the country. And some of those shadows stretch far beyond reform schools. Tonight, we're going to take you from the halls of Preston to another place shaped by isolation, fear, and the stories left behind. A place hundreds of miles away, but eerily similar in what it became. Let's head to Minnesota.
So, let's dive into Minnesota, the history of Anoka State Hospital. Anoka State Hospital opened in 1900s in Anoka, Minnesota. Today, it is known as Anoka Metro Regional Treatment Center. It was built during a time when mental illness was poorly understood and large state hospitals were the primary response. These ins- ins- institutions were meant to provide long term care, but they also removed people from society. Patients were admitted for many reasons: several mental illness, alcoholism, epilepsy, depression, and conditions that will be treated very differently today. As patient numbers increased through the early and mid 20th century, Anoka expanded. Like many state hospitals, it faced overcrowding and limited resources. The hospital reflects an era when isolation was considered treatment.
Life inside Anoka State Hospital followed strict institutional routines. Treatment methods focused on supervision and confinement based on the medical standards of the time. Many patients remained at the hospital for years, sometimes decades, with little opportunity to return to normal life. As mental health reform progressed in the mid to late 20th century, large institutions like Anoka began to change. Buildings were closed, renovated, or left unused as care shifted toward community based treatment. What remains is a documented history of isolation, loss of autonomy, and lives spent almost entirely behind locked doors.
Anoka State Hospital has developed a reputation as one of Minnesota's most haunted locations. People have spent time in the older buildings, described footsteps echoing through empty hallways, voices in unused areas, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Some describe sudden cold spots or movement where no one should be. Others say the silence itself feels heavy, as if the building remembers everything that happened inside it. Anoka's atmosphere leaves a lasting impression, one that many say follows them long after they leave.
Maybe Anoka isn't haunted by what we see, but by what was left behind, and some places never forget.
Places like Preston Castle and Anoka State Hospital remind us that some stories cling to the walls long after the people are gone, but not every haunting needs a building. Some stories follow us into the streets, the forests, and places we pass every day without thinking. Next week, we're stepping out of institutions and into the world of urban legends. The whispers, warnings, and eerie tales that spread from person to person until they feel almost real. Some legends are cautionary, some are comforting, and some feel a little too close to the truth. And this has been Sisters of the Shadows.
You've been listening to Sisters of the Shadows. Share this episode, follow us on TikTok, X, and Instagram, and keep the light close until next time.